Charles Manson never held the knife on the nights that made him the most hated man in America. On August 9, 1969, 5 people were murdered at 150 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. Manson was not there. The following night, 2 more died in a house on Waverly Drive. Manson entered, tied the victims up, and left before a single wound was inflicted. Yet a jury sentenced him to death, and history remembers his face, not theirs. How does a man stand 5 feet 6 inches tall, spend more than half his life inside prison walls, own nothing, command no army, and still convince ordinary young Americans, college students, church choir girls, homecoming princesses to slaughter strangers on his word alone? The answer is not hypnosis. It is not drugs. It is a system. A method of control, assembled piece by piece over 17 years of incarceration, refined in the streets of San Francisco, and deployed on a ranch in the hills above Los Angeles. This is the anatomy of that system. From the first file ever opened on Charles Manson to the last unanswered question he left behind. To understand what Manson built, you have to understand what built Manson. And that story begins not with a crime, but with a birth certificate that carried no name at all. On November 12, 1934, at Cincinnati General Hospital in Ohio, a 16-year-old girl named Kathleen Maddox gave birth to a son. For the first weeks of his life, the hospital records identified the child simply as no-name Maddox. His mother had not decided what to call him. She had barely decided whether to keep him. The father, a man named Colonel Walker Scott, Colonel was his given name, not a rank, had abandoned Kathleen upon learning of the pregnancy. She would later win a small judgment against him in a paternity suit. He paid almost none of it. The boy would meet his biological father exactly 0 times in his life. Kathleen briefly married a laborer named William Manson, and the child received the surname that would one day be printed on every front page in the country. The marriage collapsed quickly. What followed in the boy's earliest years was a pattern that criminal psychologists would later identify as one of the most consistent predictors in their field: profound, repeated, structural abandonment. Kathleen Maddox was, by every account including her own family's, unequipped for motherhood. She drank heavily. She moved constantly between Cincinnati, Ashland, Kentucky, and the homes of relatives who took the boy in for weeks or months at a time. In 1939, when Charles was 5 years old, Kathleen and her brother robbed a service station in Charleston, West Virginia, using a ketchup bottle pressed into the attendant's back to simulate a gun. She was sentenced to 5 years in the West Virginia State Penitentiary. Her son was sent to live with an aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia, a strict religious household where Manson later claimed his uncle mocked him as a sissy and sent him to his first day of school in a dress to teach him to act like a man. That story, like many Manson told, cannot be fully verified, and that is a critical point that will follow this entire case. Manson was an unreliable narrator of his own life from the very beginning. He told interviewers his mother once traded him to a waitress for a pitcher of beer. Relatives disputed it, but whether or not the specific anecdotes were true, the documented record is damning enough on its own. Court files, school records, and social worker reports from the 1940s describe a child shuttled between at least a half-dozen households, a mother who repeatedly attempted to place him in foster care, and finally, in 1947, a judge's decision that would begin Manson's institutional life. He was 12 years old, The Gibol School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, was a Catholic reform school for delinquent and abandoned children. Manson lasted 10 months before running away, back to his mother who turned him away. Read that sequence again, because psychologists who later studied the case identified it as a foundational wound. A 12-year-old escapes an institution, crosses a state to reach the only attachment figure he has, and is rejected. He never lived with her again. What followed was a 14-year tour of the American correctional system, and the file grew thicker at every stop. Boys Town in Nebraska, the famous sanctuary immortalized in the Spencer Tracy film, accepted him in 1949 after a local newspaper ran a sympathetic story about the small boy with the sad story. He fled after 4 days, stealing a car with another boy and committing 2 armed robberies on the road. He was caught, sent to the Indiana Boys' School in Plainfield, and there, by his own account and consistent with institutional records of the era, he was beaten and sexually assaulted repeatedly by older boys. He ran away from Plainfield 18 times. On the 19th attempt, in February 1951, he and 2 other boys made it as far as Utah in a series of stolen cars, a federal offense the moment they crossed a state line. Charles Manson, age 16, entered the federal system. It is here, in the records of the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C., that we find the first professional psychological assessments of Manson, and they are among the most important documents in this entire case. A caseworker in 1951 described him as aggressively antisocial. His IQ was measured at 109, slightly above average. But one examiner wrote an observation that reads, 7 decades later, like a prophecy. The boy, he noted, had developed certain techniques for survival, an ability to read authority figures instantly, to present whatever version of himself the person across the desk wanted to see, and to manipulate sympathy with an almost professional skill. One psychiatrist was so thoroughly charmed that he recommended transfer to a minimum security honor camp. Weeks before a parole hearing he was favored to win, Manson held a razor blade to another boy's throat and raped him. He was 17. The pattern that would define him was already complete and documented in government files. Charm as a weapon, cruelty when the charm was no longer needed, and an institutional environment as his only true home. The 1950s became a revolving door. Paroled in 1954. Married a hospital waitress named Rosalie Willis in 1955. The marriage produced a son, Charles Manson Jr., who would spend his life fleeing the name and die by suicide in 1993. Arrested for driving stolen cars across state lines. Sent to Terminal Island Prison in San Pedro, California. Paroled in 1958. He worked briefly as a pimp in Hollywood, recruiting and managing young women, a detail worth holding on to, because the skill set of a pimp, criminologists note, is precisely the skill set Manson would later scale up. Identify vulnerable young women, isolate them from family, alternate affection with degradation, and convert their loyalty into labor. In 1959, he was convicted of forging a U.S. Treasury check for $37.50. A 10-year suspended sentence became a real one in 1960 when he violated probation, and Manson was sent to the federal penitentiary on McNeil Island, Washington. He would remain in federal custody for 7 years. And those 7 years were not wasted time. They were, in a very real sense, Manson's university. At McNeil Island, Manson took the prison's Dale Carnegie course, the same How to Win Friends and Influence People curriculum sold to salesmen across America. Fellow inmates and prison staff confirmed he studied it obsessively. Carnegie's techniques appear almost verbatim in the later accounts of family members. Let the other person feel the idea is theirs. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. Make the other person feel important, and do it sincerely. He absorbed fragments of Scientology from an inmate named Lanier Rayner, adopting its vocabulary of auditing and past trauma, less as a believer than as a technician stripping a machine for parts. He studied the Bible, particularly the Book of Revelation, whose 9th chapter he would later weaponize. And he learned guitar from a man uniquely qualified to teach him about American infamy, Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, former public enemy #1 of the Barker Karpis gang, one of the last surviving celebrity criminals of the 1930s. Music became Manson's obsession. This was the early 1960s. The Beatles arrived in America in 1964 while Manson sat in his cell, and he became convinced, with the specific, grandiose certainty that examiners kept flagging in his file, that he was destined to be bigger than them. A 1961 prison report noted his tremendous drive to call attention to himself. A later evaluation observed that he hides his loneliness, resentment, and hostility behind a facade of superficial ingratiation. The staff at Terminal Island, where he was transferred for his final stretch, saw the file in full. 32 years old, more than 17 of those years spent inside institutions, no family, no trade, no plan. Which brings us to the morning of March 21, 1967, and one of the most quietly chilling details in the entire record. As his release was processed, Manson made a request to the officers at Terminal Island. He asked to stay. Prison, he told them, was the only home he had. The request was denied. Charles Manson walked out with $35, a guitar, and a set of manipulation techniques tested on the hardest audience in America, convicts and prison psychiatrists, for 17 years. He requested permission to move to San Francisco. Permission was granted, and the timing of that transfer is the hinge on which this entire case turns. Because the San Francisco that Charles Manson entered in the spring of 1967 was unlike any city in American history before or since. The Haight-Ashbury district was filling with tens of thousands of young people in the build-up to what the press would call the Summer of Love. They were fleeing suburban homes, distrustful of parents, police, and every institution, and desperately, openly searching for exactly two things: chemical transcendence and someone who seemed to have answers. Into this crowd walked a man who had spent his entire adult life learning how to read the vulnerable. Armed with Carnegie's rapport techniques, Scientology's therapeutic vocabulary, scripture, and a guitar. The wolf had been released into the one meadow in America where the sheep were actively looking for a shepherd. The first was Mary Bruner, a 23-year-old assistant librarian at the University of California, Berkeley, a quiet, educated young woman from Wisconsin. Manson approached her with a dog, a guitar, and no visible agenda. He moved into her apartment. Then, using a technique he would repeat with clinical consistency, he began testing her boundaries. Could he bring another young woman to stay with them, just as a friend? Then a third. Bruner's initial objections were worn down one small concession at a time. And this, forensic psychologists emphasize, is the actual mechanism behind the myth. Not mind control, incremental boundary erosion, each step small enough to rationalize, each rationalization making the next step easier. By the end of 1967, roughly a dozen young women were traveling with Manson in a converted school bus. Lynette Fromm, 18, found crying on a Venice Beach curb after a fight with her father. Manson sat beside her and said he was the god of fuck. A bizarre opening that worked because it was followed by hours of attentive listening. Patricia Krenwinkel, a 20-year-old insurance clerk who had sung in her church choir, abandoned her car and her final paycheck to follow him after a single weekend. Susan Atkins, 21, a topless dancer with her own institutional childhood. Each recruitment followed the same documented sequence. Identify the wound, a cruel father, a broken engagement, crushing insecurity about appearance, reflect the person's pain back at them with total attention, offer unconditional acceptance, then bind them to the group with sex, LSD, and the slow, systematic dismantling of their previous identity. Names were changed, birthdays abolished, watches discarded, contact with parents severed. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi would later summarize the operation in a single sentence. Manson had an uncanny ability to detect, within minutes of meeting someone, exactly what they needed, and to become it. None of this so far is murder. In the spring of 1968, the group now calling itself the Family was simply one more commune in a California full of them, scavenging food from grocery store dumpsters, singing Manson's songs around campfires, drifting south toward Los Angeles. What transformed this cult from a strange but non-violent collective into a killing organization was a collision of three specific forces: a failed music career, an apocalyptic prophecy built from a Beatles record, and a decrepit movie ranch in the hills, where an old blind man let them stay in exchange for chores. Because in the spring of 1968, two of the Manson girls hitchhiking were picked up by a driver whose identity would alter the course of this case. He was a founding member of one of the biggest bands in America, and he took them home. The driver's name was Dennis Wilson. He was the drummer of the Beach Boys. Wilson picked up Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey hitchhiking in Malibu, twice by most accounts, and eventually brought them back to his log cabin mansion at 14400 Sunset Boulevard. He left for a recording session. When he returned at 3 a.m, a strange small man walked out of his own house, dropped to his knees in the driveway, and kissed Wilson's feet. Inside were roughly a dozen members of the family, already making themselves at home. For any ordinary group of squatters, that night would have ended with a phone call to the police. Instead, Dennis Wilson let them stay for months. Understand what Manson had just acquired, and understand that none of it was luck. Wilson was famous, wealthy, generous, and, by his own brothers' and bandmates' descriptions, the most restless and insecure of the Beach Boys, living in the shadow of Brian's genius. Manson read him the way he had read prison psychiatrists and lonely girls on beach curbs. He offered Wilson philosophy, adoration, an endless supply of young women, and the intoxicating feeling of having discovered an authentic street genius. The summer of 1968 cost Wilson, by his own estimate, around $100,000. Wrecked cars, food, clothing, and medical bills for the entire family. He later called it the most expensive mistake of his life, in more than money. But the traffic ran in both directions, because Wilson gave Manson the one thing 17 years of prison never could: access. Access to studio time. Access to Rudy Altobelli, a talent manager. Access to Greg Jacobson, a talent scout who genuinely believed in Manson's raw sound. And access to a record producer named Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day and one of the most powerful hitmakers in Los Angeles. Hold on to the name Terry Melcher. Hold on, above all, to his address. Because at the time, Terry Melcher lived with his girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen, in a rented house at the end of a cul-de-sac in Benedict Canyon. The address was 150 Cielo Drive. The Beach Boys actually recorded one of Manson's songs. He had written a track called Cease to Exist. The band reworked it, changed the lyrics, retitled it Never Learn Not to Love, and released it as a B-side in December 1968, with the songwriting credit given solely to Dennis Wilson. Accounts differ on whether Manson traded the credit for cash and a motorcycle, but every account agrees on his reaction. He was enraged. The one thing he wanted was the name. Witnesses recalled Manson showing Wilson a bullet and telling him to look after his children. By the end of 1968, Wilson had quietly moved out of his own mansion and let the lease expire rather than evict the family himself. His managers did it for him. The family relocated to a place that could have been designed by a screenwriter for exactly this story. Spahn Movie Ranch, a crumbling 55-acre former film set in the Santa Susana Mountains above Chatsworth, where westerns and television serials had once been shot. Its owner, George Spahn, was 80 years old and blind. Manson installed the family in the derelict western sets and negotiated rent the only way he ever negotiated anything. He assigned Lynette Fromm to be the old man's companion, cook, and lover. Spahn gave her the nickname Squeaky. The family stayed for free. It was at Spahn Ranch across 1969 that the commune hardened into something else, and the forensic record lets us track the transformation stage by stage. Manson's control systems, refined for years on individuals, were now applied to a closed population of 20 to 30 people in physical isolation. LSD was administered communally, with Manson, by multiple family members' sworn testimony, taking smaller doses than everyone else, or none, so that he remained the only sober architect in a room full of dissolved egos. Sermons ran for hours. Sex was choreographed by Manson as deliberately as a director blocking a scene, used to break pairings, loyalty to any person other than him, and any residual sense of bodily autonomy. Food, sleep, and information all flowed through him. Former members described the same detail decades apart. At Spahn Ranch, there were no clocks and no calendars. Time itself belonged to Charlie. And then, into this sealed environment, Manson introduced the doctrine that gave the machine its direction. In November 1968, the Beatles released the double album officially titled The Beatles, known to the world as the White Album. Manson played it obsessively and announced to the family that the band was speaking directly to him in code. Blackbird was a call for Black America to rise. Piggies identified the enemy, the wealthy establishment who deserved, in the song's words, a damn good whacking. Revolution 9 was the sound of the coming war itself, and he tied it to the 9th chapter of the Book of Revelation he had studied in prison, the chapter with locusts wearing their hair like women, breastplates of fire, and a bottomless pit. And one song title became the name of the prophecy itself, Helter, Skelter. In Britain, A helter-skelter is a spiral fairground slide. Manson either did not know or did not care. To him, it was the abyss, the fall of the old world. The doctrine, assembled from these fragments, went like this. A race war was imminent. Black America would rise and slaughter white America. The family would survive by hiding in a secret city beneath Death Valley, the bottomless pit of revelation. The victorious black population, in Manson's openly racist cosmology, would prove incapable of governing and would turn to the only organized white group left, the family, who would emerge from the desert to rule the new world. Manson set the family to work preparing, acquiring dune buggies, mapping desert routes, stockpiling supplies at a second location, the remote Barker Ranch on the edge of Death Valley. There was only one problem with the prophecy. The apocalypse refused to arrive, and by the summer of 1969, Manson began telling the family the sentence that prosecutors would place at the center of the entire case. If Blackie didn't know how to start Helter Skelter, Charlie would have to show him how to do it. Before we reach August, the record demands a stop at the first killing. Because the Tate murders were not the family's first blood, and the actual first murder exposes something the mythology usually hides. Beneath the apocalyptic theater, the triggering events were almost always small, sordid, and financial. Gary Hinman was a 34-year-old music teacher working toward a doctorate at UCLA, a gentle, politically progressive Buddhist who had befriended various family members and let them stay at his Topanga Canyon home. In late July 1969, Manson became convinced Hinman had money, inheritance, or proceeds from a drug transaction, depending on the account. On July 25th, he sent Bobby Beausoleil, a strikingly handsome young musician and family associate, along with Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner, to collect it. Hinman insisted truthfully that there was nothing to collect. Beausoleil held him at gunpoint and telephoned the ranch. Manson arrived personally, and here the record is specific and consistent across testimony. Manson slashed the left side of Hinman's face with a sword, cutting through his cheek and nearly severing his ear. Then he left, taking Hinman's ownership papers for 2 vehicles as payment, and handed the situation back to Beausoleil. For 2 more days, the 3 family members held the wounded man in his own house, while the women sutured his face with dental floss. On July 27th, on instructions Beausoleil later attributed directly to Manson, he stabbed Gary Hinman to death. Before leaving, the killers dipped a hand in Hinman's blood and wrote on the wall, "Political Piggy." Beside it, they drew a panther paw print, the intended signature of the Black Panthers. This is the detail to hold. The misdirection was not an afterthought. Framing black militants for a white man's murder was the entire point. Helter Skelter, as practiced, was a false flag operation. On August 6, 1969, Bobby Beausoleil was arrested driving Gary Hinman's Fiat station wagon. The murder weapon was in the wheel well. He was in custody, facing a murder charge, and the family knew it. 3 days later, the family committed the murders at Cielo Drive. And one of the defense theories raised in the decades since, rejected by the prosecution, but never fully silenced, is that the infamous phrase "left in blood at the scene" was partly a copycat gambit. Commit similar murders with similar writing while Bobby sat in jail, and the police might conclude the real killer was still free. Whether motive number 1 was apocalypse, copycat, or a leader who felt his control slipping and needed an irreversible act of loyalty, That question is exactly where this case stops being a horror story and becomes a psychological one. Because now, every component of the machine was in place. A guru with total control over a sealed group. A doctrine that made murder not a crime, but a cosmic necessity. A membership stripped of identity, ego dissolved by a year of acid and sermons, trained on desert drills and creepy crawling missions, nighttime break-ins into strangers' homes, moving furniture while the owners slept, practicing the erasure of fear. A first murder already committed, and a member already in jail for it. And a leader whose one authentic dream, the record deal, the name on the label, being bigger than the Beatles, had been humiliated in the one house in Los Angeles he could not stop thinking about. Terry Melcher had, in fact, come to Spahn Ranch to hear Manson play. Twice, in May 1969, he was politely unimpressed, offered no contract, and moved on with his life, including moving out of the house on Cielo Drive in January, a fact Manson knew perfectly well because he had gone looking for Melcher there in March and been turned away at the door by the property's photographer tenant while the new leaseholders were home. Remember that. Manson knew Melcher was gone. He had seen the new tenant's world with his own eyes. The new tenant was a 26-year-old actress, 8.5 months pregnant, whose director husband was in London finishing a screenplay. Her name was Sharon Tate. And what happened to her, to the 4 people with her, and to Leno and Rosemary LaBianca the following night, is where this case enters the 2 hours that changed American culture permanently. Hours we can now reconstruct minute by minute from the testimony of the people Manson sent. On the afternoon of August 8, 1969, Charles Manson stood on the boardwalk of Spahn Ranch and said to the assembled family, "Now is the time for Helter Skelter." That evening he gave Charles Tex Watson, a 23-year-old former honor student and high school athlete from Copeville, Texas, now his most obedient lieutenant, a set of instructions that Watson would repeat in nearly identical words. Across 5 decades of parole hearings, go to the old Melcher house, kill everyone inside, and make it as gruesome as possible. Manson selected 3 women to go with him: Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. A recent arrival, chosen, prosecutors later argued, largely because she was the only one with a valid driver's license. Manson told the women to do whatever Tex said. He himself stayed at the ranch. Mark that fact, because it is the legal heart of this case. The man who ordered the massacre was 20 miles away when it happened. The 4 drove a battered 1959 Ford to Benedict Canyon. Around midnight, Watson climbed a telephone pole beside the gate of 150 Cielo Drive and cut the phone line. It is worth pausing on who was inside the property that night, because the mythology reduces them to a single name, and they were 5 separate human beings. Sharon Tate, 26, was 2 weeks from her due date. She had risen from Texas beauty pageants to a Golden Globe nomination for Valley of the Dolls. Her husband, director Roman Polanski, was in London, and friends were staying with her so she would not be alone in the final stretch of her pregnancy. Jay Sebring, 35, was Hollywood's most famous men's hairstylist. He had cut the hair of Steve McQueen, Frank Sinatra, and Jim Morrison, and was Sharon's former fiancée, still devoted to her. Abigail Folger, 25, was the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, a Radcliffe graduate who spent her days doing volunteer social work in Watts. Her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, 32, was a Polish writer and childhood friend of Polanski. And Stephen Parent, just 18, was not a resident or a guest of the house at all, an electronics enthusiast from El Monte who had driven up that night to visit William Garretson, the young caretaker who lived in the guest house, hoping to sell him a clock radio. Stephen Parent died first. At approximately 12:15 a.m., he was driving his father's white Rambler down the driveway toward the gate when Watson stepped out of the darkness. Parent begged. Witnesses to his last recorded words would testify that he said he wouldn't tell anyone. Watson shot him 4 times, an 18-year-old boy, in the wrong driveway on the wrong night, killed for the crime of visiting a caretaker who never even heard what happened next. The 4 intruders entered the house. Kasabian was posted outside as lookout, a position that would later make her the prosecution's star witness. What followed inside, reconstructed from Watson's and Atkins's own accounts and the physical evidence processed by LAPD, took less than an hour. Frykowski, asleep on the living room couch, woke to a gun in his face and asked who Watson was. The answer Watson gave has been quoted in every account of this case since, because it distills the entire pathology of Spahn Ranch into one sentence. "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The victims were gathered and bound. Sebring protested the treatment of the pregnant Sharon and was shot, then stabbed. Frykowski fought harder than anyone, breaking free, battling Watson across the living room and out onto the lawn. The coroner documented 2 gunshot wounds, 13 blows to the head, and 51 stab wounds. Abigail Folger nearly escaped through a bedroom window and was run down on the lawn by Krenwinkel. Her last recorded words, according to family testimony, "Stop, I'm already dead." Sharon Tate was killed last, pleading not for herself, but for her unborn son. Susan Atkins would tell a cellmate in the jailhouse confession that eventually broke the case, that she told the actress she had no mercy for her. Sharon was stabbed 16 times. Before leaving, on Watson's reminder of Manson's instruction to leave a sign, Atkins took a towel, soaked it in Sharon Tate's blood, and wrote a single word on the front door: pig. 5 people, 6, counting the son Sharon would have named Paul Richard, were dead. The killers changed clothes, threw the bloody bundle down a hillside embankment, and drove back to Spahn Ranch, where by every account Charles Manson asked one question: did they have any remorse? The answer was no. The word came back down the chain exactly as it had gone up, but Manson was not satisfied. According to family testimony, he told the group that the Tate murders had been too messy, too much panic, too little control. So the following night, August 10th, he did something he had never done before and would never do again. He went along himself. This is the night that convicts him, so watch his choices carefully. 7 of them drove for hours through Los Angeles. Manson, Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, Kasabian, Leslie Van Houten, and Steve Clem Grogan, while Manson evaluated and rejected potential targets like a location scout. Sometime after 1 a.m., he directed the car to 3301 Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz district. The house next door was one the family knew. They had attended parties there. The choice was not random. It was adjacent to familiar ground. Inside lived Leno LaBianca, 44, the president of a family-owned chain of Los Angeles grocery stores, and his wife Rosemary, 38, a successful dress shop owner who had built an investment portfolio worth more than most executives of her era. They had returned after midnight from a lake trip, dropping Rosemary's daughter at her apartment on the way. Lena was reading the sports section on the couch, and then Charles Manson walked into their living room. By the consistent testimony of those present, Manson, alone or with Watson, accounts vary on this single point, tied up the couple at gunpoint, assured them they were only being robbed, took Rosemary's wallet, and then walked back out to the car. He sent Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten inside with instructions to kill them. Then he drove away, dropping the remaining family members across the city, and by some accounts stopped for a milkshake. That is the complete inventory of Charles Manson's physical participation in the Tate LaBianca murders. He tied 2 people up and left. He never stabbed, shot, or struck any of the 7 victims. The knives belonged to Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, and what they did inside that house, 41 stab wounds to Rosemary LaBianca, 12 to Leno, plus 14 punctures with a carving fork that was left standing in his body, the word war carved into his skin, they did on the orders of a man who was, by then, miles away with his milkshake. On the walls and refrigerator, in the victim's blood, they wrote, "Rise, death to pigs," and, misspelled, "Helter, Skelter." The false flag again, executed to the letter, 2 nights, 7 victims. And now comes the part of this case that almost never gets told properly because the mythology skips straight from the murders to the trial. The truth is that for 3.5 months, the Los Angeles Police Department had the biggest case in its history and could not solve it. And the reasons why form a catalogue of investigative failure that criminologists still teach. Failure 1. The 2 crime scenes were assigned to 2 different teams. The Tate murders to one set of detectives, the LaBianca murders to another. And for months, the teams barely spoke. Despite blood-written slogans at both scenes, despite the word pig on one door and death to pigs on another wall one night apart, the official position for far too long was that the cases were probably unrelated. The Tate team fixated on a drug deal theory. Frykowski had connections to dealers, Sebring used cocaine, and the narrative of Hollywood decadence turning fatal was simply easier to believe than anything resembling the truth. Failure 2. The police already had the answer in their files and did not see it. Detectives investigating the Gary Hinman murder, political piggy on the wall, remember, had already arrested Bobby Beausoleil and knew he ran with a commune at Spahn Ranch. A young Lasso detective explicitly suggested the cases might connect. The suggestion went nowhere for months. Failure 3, and the most painful, on August 16, 1969, 1 week after the murders, police raided Spahn Ranch. They arrested Manson and 25 members of the family. The raid was about stolen dune buggies, part of an auto theft investigation. The murderers of Sharon Tate were in police custody, photographed and fingerprinted 7 days after the crime. The warrant had been misdated. Everyone was released within 72 hours. The case did not break through forensic brilliance. It broke because the family destroyed itself. In October, after Manson moved the group to Barker Ranch on the edge of Death Valley to await the apocalypse, local officers and park rangers raided the place. Again, not for murder, but for torching an earth mover and running a stolen vehicle operation. Officers found Manson hiding in a cabinet under a bathroom sink. And in custody on an unrelated charge, Susan Atkins began to talk. She told her cellmates about Cielo Drive, in detail, with pride, laughing. One of them, Virginia Graham, went to the authorities. In parallel, a family associate named Kitty Lutzinger had already begun connecting the Hinman and Tate cases for detectives, and a biker who had hung around the ranch, Danny DiCarlo, filled in the structure. By early December 1969, the LAPD announced the case was solved. When the story broke, the name and face that appeared on every screen in America belonged to the one participant who had killed no one that August, Charles Manson. The trial that followed, beginning in June 1970, remains the longest and one of the most expensive murder trials in American history to that point. 9.5 months, a sequestered jury, and a defendant who converted the courtroom into the stage he had been denied by the record industry. Manson arrived on the first day with an X carved into his forehead, declaring he had X'd himself out of society. Within days, his 3 co-defendants, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, appeared with identical wounds. Every gesture he made, they mirrored. When he lunged at the judge with a pencil, screaming that someone should cut his head off, the judge began carrying a revolver under his robes. When Manson shaved his head, the girls shaved theirs. Outside the courthouse, family members led by Squeaky Fromm kept vigil on the sidewalk corner for months. Heads shaved, X's on their foreheads, telling every camera that Charlie was love. The prosecution's problem was the same fact this entire story has been circling. How do you convict a man of first-degree murder for killings he did not physically commit? Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi's answer was to prosecute the doctrine itself. Using the felony murder rule and the law of vicarious liability for co-conspirators, Bugliosi argued that Helter, Skelter, the race war prophecy, the White Album exegesis, the desert pit, was not colorful background, but the motive and the mechanism. Proof that the killers acted as instruments of Manson's design. To prove it, he needed a witness from inside the conspiracy. He found her in Linda Kasabian, the lookout who had killed no one, who had watched Frykowski die on the lawn and testified that she prayed for the killing to stop. She spent 18 days on the stand under withering cross-examination from 4 defense teams and never broke. In exchange for her testimony, she received full immunity. The trial produced moments that have entered legal history. President Richard Nixon, mid-trial, declared to reporters that Manson was guilty, a potential mistrial catastrophe made worse when Manson gleefully held up a newspaper headline reading "Manson guilty, Nixon declares for the jury to see." The defense rested without calling a single witness, partly to prevent the 3 women from testifying, as they were eager to do, that they had planned everything themselves and Charlie was innocent. Manson himself testified only with the jury removed, delivering an hour-long monologue that remains one of the strangest documents in American jurisprudence. These children that come at you with knives, they are your children. You taught them. I didn't teach them. I just tried to help them stand up. And midway through the proceedings, the case claimed what many consider its 8th victim. Ronald Hughes, the young attorney representing Leslie Van Houten, had begun visibly separating his client's defense from Manson's, a strategy Manson did not appreciate. In November 1970, during a recess, Hughes went camping in the Sespe wilderness and vanished. His decomposed body was found months later, wedged in a creek. The death was never ruled a homicide. The case remains officially undetermined. But a family associate would later claim it had been a retaliation killing, and among prosecutors and reporters who lived through the trial, few believed it was an accident. On January 25, 1971, the jury convicted Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten of first-degree murder and conspiracy on all counts. Tex Watson, who had fled to Texas and fought extradition, was convicted separately later that year. On March 29th, the same jury sentenced all of them to death. Manson shaved his head for the verdict and told the courtroom, "You people have no authority over me." He was wrong about many things, but about that, in a strange way, history was about to prove him half right. Because in February 1972, the Supreme Court of California abolished the death penalty in the state, and every death sentence, including those of the Tate LaBianca killers, was automatically commuted to life in prison. And in 1969, life in California law meant life with the possibility of parole. The murderer of no one was now the most famous killer in America, with a legal path, however theoretical, back to the street. What Manson did with the next 46 years of incarceration, what became of the followers when the spell broke, and the two questions the case never answered, are the final chapters. Prison did not end Charles Manson's influence. For a brief, surreal window in the mid-1970s, it looked as though it might extend it into the White House. On September 5, 1975, in Sacramento's Capitol Park, a small, red-robed woman stepped out of a crowd greeting President Gerald Ford, raised a Colt .45 pistol, and pointed it at him from roughly 2 feet away. The gun did not fire. There was no round in the chamber. Secret Service agents wrestled her to the ground, and as they did, she said, almost conversationally, "It didn't go off." The woman was Lynette Squeaky Fromm. The 18-year-old Manson had found crying on a Venice Beach curb 8 years earlier, the companion assigned to blind George Spahn, the leader of the shaved-head vigil outside the trial. 6 years after the murders, with Manson locked in a cell hundreds of miles away, his most devoted follower attempted to assassinate the President of the United States, by her own explanation, in part to give Charlie a platform. A new trial meant new cameras. She was sentenced to life in federal prison. She was paroled in 2009, and as of her last public statements, still described Manson in terms of love. Fromm's pistol is the most dramatic data point in the question that dominates the post-conviction chapter of this case. How long does the programming last after the programmer is removed? The answer, tracked across the surviving family members, splits into 2 starkly different curves, and the difference between them is the most instructive psychological evidence the case ever produced. The first curve is Fromm's, the followers who never got out. Sandra Good, Fromm's closest ally, served 10 years in federal prison for mailing hundreds of death threats to corporate executives on behalf of Manson's environmental doctrine, an ideology he branded ATBA, air, trees, water, animals, and upon release moved to a town near his prison to be close to him. Into the 2000s, she maintained websites defending him. The spell, for some, was permanent. The second curve belongs to the killers themselves, and it is stranger because the ones who committed the actual murders are the ones who woke up. The mechanism of their awakening was banal. Distance. Prison separated them from Manson, from the LSD, from the closed information loop of the ranch. Deprogramming, it turned out, required nothing more exotic than time outside the machine. Susan Atkins, whose jailhouse bragging broke the case, renounced Manson within a few years, became a born-again Christian in 1974, married twice, and spent decades as, by most accounts, a model prisoner. She was denied parole 13 times. In 2008, dying of brain cancer, with one leg amputated and paralyzed on one side, she petitioned for compassionate release. The board denied it. She died in prison in September 2009, 40 years after she wrote Pig on a door in Sharon Tate's blood. Patricia Krenwinkel, the church choir girl who chased Abigail Folger across a lawn, became, after Atkins's death, the longest-serving female inmate in California. In interviews, she has refused every opportunity to minimize her role, describing herself as having been a coward who traded her identity for the feeling of being loved. Parole denied at last count more than a dozen times. A 2022 recommendation for release was reversed by the governor. She remains incarcerated as of this recording. Leslie Van Houten, the former homecoming princess who was 19 at Waverly Drive, became the test case for the entire question of whether a Manson killer could ever be considered rehabilitated. College degrees earned inside, decades of clean records, psychiatric evaluations describing complete transformation, and parole recommendations repeatedly reversed at the governor's desk, first by Jerry Brown, then Gavin Newsom. In 2023, an appeals court overrode the reversal, and Van Houten walked out of prison after 53 years. The only one of the killers from those two nights to ever be released. Tex Watson, the devil doing the devil's business, the hands that killed at both houses, became an ordained minister inside prison, married and fathered 4 children through conjugal visits before California ended them for lifers. He has been denied parole 18 times. Bobby Beausoleil, whose arrest for the Hinman murder lit the fuse, remains in prison after more than 50 years. Linda Kasabian, the immunized witness, lived quietly under other names, gave a final interview in 2009 saying she still felt the weight every day, and died in 2023. And Manson himself? Here the record delivers its final bitter irony. The man convicted for controlling others could not control himself for a single decade of incarceration. His disciplinary file ran past 100 violations: weapons, drugs, threats, a hacksaw blade, a homemade knife. In 1984, at Vacaville, another inmate, a Hare Krishna follower Manson had threatened, doused him with paint thinner and set him on fire, burning his face, scalp, and hands. He survived. He spent most of his sentence in protective housing at Corcoran State Prison because the most feared name in America was inside the walls, a 5'6", 60-year-old whom other inmates saw as a trophy. He was denied parole 12 times, the final time in 2012, when he told the panel, in a rare moment of what may have been honesty, "I'm special. I'm not like the average inmate. I have put 5 people in the grave. I am a very dangerous man." He stopped attending his own hearings, and in the vacuum he conducted the longest media residency in criminal history. The Tom Snyder interview of 1981, Charlie Rose in 1986, Geraldo Rivera in 1988, Diane Sawyer in 1994, each network knowing exactly what it was buying, each interview delivering the wild-eyed, rambling performance that kept the brand alive. Criminologists point to those broadcasts as a foundational error in how media handles infamy. Every hour of airtime confirmed to Manson, and taught the audience, that the currency he had chased since the Terminal Island file noted his tremendous drive to call attention to himself. Attention itself could still be earned with nothing but a stare and an X-turned swastika carved in his forehead. The performances hid a quieter absurdity. Manson's actual prison life, described by staff and correspondents, was small. He made string dolls and scorpions from thread, played guitar, tended to his Atway philosophy, and answered fan mail, of which he received more than almost any inmate in the American system, thousands of letters a year, many from people born decades after 1969. In 2014, aged 80, he obtained a marriage license with a 26-year-old woman who ran websites proclaiming his innocence. The license expired unused. Reports later suggested the plan had involved, after his death, displaying his body, a claim she denied. Even his final romance dissolved into competing narratives, which was, in its way, the most Manson ending possible. On November 19, 2017, Charles Manson died of cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure and colon cancer at a hospital in Bakersfield, California. He was 83. He had spent, by the arithmetic of his own biography, more than 60 of those years inside institutions. 4 men, in a Kern County Commissioner's hearing, later fought over his remains and estate. A purported grandson, a pen pal with a will of contested validity, a memorabilia collector. The grandson prevailed and, wanting to end the circus, had the body cremated and scattered. There is no grave. There is nothing to visit. The man who wanted his name to outlive the Beatles left no marker at all, and his name outlived him anyway, which is precisely the problem the final chapter of this case has to confront. Because the ledger of Charles Manson does not close with 7 victims in August 1969, the confirmed and probable count is longer. Gary Hinman, tortured for 2 days in July. Donald Shorty Shea, a Spahn Ranch stuntman and hand, killed by family members in late August 1969 because they believed, wrongly on both counts, that he was a police informant whose testimony could hurt them. His body was not found until 1977, when Steve Grogan, convicted of the murder, drew a map from prison. Grogan, incidentally, became the only person ever convicted of a Manson-ordered murder to be paroled and fully disappear into a law-abiding life. Deprogramming's single complete success story. Ronald Hughes, the drowned attorney, officially undetermined. John Philip Hort, a family associate who died of a gunshot during a game of Russian roulette in a house full of family members 3 weeks after the arrests, ruled accidental, doubted ever since. And beyond the names, the numbers Manson himself threw around in interviews, claims of 35 killings, which investigators never substantiated and which were, like most of what he said on camera, probably advertising. 7 convicted for, 9 to 11 plausible, and 1 more category of casualty that no court ever counted, the followers themselves. Not as sympathy, Krenwinkel herself rejects that framing, but as evidence. Because the final question this case asks is the one the psychiatric evaluations, the trial transcripts, and 5 decades of parole hearings have circled without ever fully closing. What exactly did Charles Manson do to those young people that a jury decided was worth a death sentence, while the hands that held the knives, one by one, came to be seen by parole boards as capable of redemption? That question, the machinery of the influence itself, what the experts concluded, what remains unexplained, and why this case, more than any body count, is the reason the phrase cult leader means what it means today, is where this file closes. Strip away the swastika, the stare, and the half-century of mythology, And what remains in the file is a question of engineering. How was it done? Not why. Why is a swamp? How is a mechanism? And mechanisms can be taken apart. Across the trial record, the parole transcripts, and 50 years of psychiatric literature built on this case, the machine Manson operated resolves into 6 components. None of them is supernatural. All of them are documented, and that is precisely what makes them worth examining, because every one of them still works. Component 1, target selection. Manson did not recruit randomly, and he did not recruit the weak in any obvious sense. Krenwinkel had a job. Van Houten had been homecoming princess. Brunner had a university position. What they shared was not incapacity, but a wound in the same location, a rupture with the family of origin, and a hunger for unconditional acceptance that the era had promised them and failed to deliver. Manson's 17 institutional years had made him a connoisseur of exactly this profile. Prison psychologists had documented the skill in 1951, the ability to read, within minutes, what the person across from him needed. He simply changed venues. Component 2, love before doctrine. No recruit was told about a race war on day 1. The first weeks were pure supply: attention, sex, food, music, a family without conditions. The doctrine arrived only after the dependency did. Modern cult research, a field that exists in its current form substantially because of this case, calls the technique love bombing and identifies the sequence as diagnostic. Acceptance first, ideology second, obligations last. Component 3, identity dissolution, new names, no clocks, no calendars, no birthdays. Contact with parents severed, personal property surrendered, sexual pairings assigned and reassigned so that no loyalty could form except the vertical one. Each element taken alone looks like commune eccentricity. Taken together, they are the systematic removal of every anchor a self can hold on to, and into the cleared space, one voice. Component 4, chemical asymmetry. The testimony is consistent. Communal LSD distributed by Manson, with Manson taking less or none. He was the sober man in the room of dissolved egos, the one stable narrative voice during experiences in which the boundaries of the self were chemically suspended. Neuroscience would take decades to describe suggestibility under psychedelics with precision. Manson had a working model by 1968. Component 5, incremental escalation. Nobody was asked to kill on arrival. First it was dumpster runs, then petty theft, then the creepy crawling missions, entering strangers' homes at night, moving objects, leaving. Each step criminal, each step small, each step normalizing the next. By the time Watson stood in a living room saying he was the devil, every prior threshold had already been crossed in miniature. The staircase, forensic psychologists note, is the point. No single step ever required a leap. Component 6, the closed loop. The prophecy was unfalsifiable by design. If the apocalypse came, Charlie was right. If it did not come, it was because the family had to start it, and Charlie was still right. Every input confirmed the doctrine. Every doubt was reframed as the doubter's ego, the very thing the family existed to kill, a system with no exit condition running on human beings. 6 components. And now the honest accounting requires the counterweight, because this case has produced 2 competing verdicts that have never been reconciled, and both are supported by the record. The first verdict is Bugliosi's, ratified by the jury. Manson the mastermind, Helter, Skelter the motive. the followers his instruments. It convicted him, and the 6 components above are its evidence. The second verdict has been argued by journalists, defense attorneys, and some of the participants themselves for 5 decades, that the mastermind narrative is partially a construction, that the copycat motive, freeing Bobby Beausoleil by replicating the Hinman scene, explains the murders more parsimoniously than an apocalyptic prophecy, that Helter Skelter made a better story for a jury and a better book title afterward, that the family was more chaotic, more drug-addled, and less centrally directed than the prosecution's clockwork required, and that Manson, a man whose entire documented life was improvisational grift, was retrofitted into a criminal genius because America needed its nightmare to have an architect. Proponents of this reading point to the inconvenient details. The murders stopped helping Beausoleil immediately. Copycat killings while he was in custody should have been publicized to his benefit and never were. The prophecy's timeline made no sense. The target selection was opportunistic, not strategic. Manson knew Melcher was gone from Cielo Drive. The truth, as the most careful students of this case have concluded, is probably not a choice between the verdicts, but a layering of them. Small, sordid motives, money, a jailed friend, a bruised ego, a leader sensing his control slipping as the desert prophecy stalled, executed through a genuine machinery of influence, and then narrated by prosecution and defendant alike as something grander. Bugliosi needed a design to convict a man who never held the knife. Manson needed a design to be more than a 5'6" ex-convict whose record deal fell through. On that one point, the need for the myth, the prosecutor and the defendant were collaborators, which leaves the unanswered questions, and this case keeps 3 of them permanently open. What happened to Ronald Hughes in that creek? Accident or the family's 8th murder has never been resolved, and every witness who could resolve it is dead or silent. How many victims preceded or followed the known ones? The Hort Roulette death, the disappearances around Barker Ranch that investigators probed and abandoned, was never established, and Manson spent his life inflating and deflating the number as the cameras required. And the largest question, the one that turned this from a murder case into a permanent cultural wound, whether the followers were victims, monsters, or proof that the categories fail. 50 years of parole hearings have functioned as an unplanned longitudinal experiment on exactly that question, and the results refuse to simplify. The hands that killed rehabilitated. Some of the hands that never touched a victim stayed loyal for life. The programming outlasted the programmer in the people farthest from the blood, and broke first in the people covered in it. What does the case of Charles Manson finally reveal about the human mind? Not that a devil walked into San Francisco in 1967. The files support something colder and more useful. It reveals that charisma is a technology, not a mystery. 6 components, learnable, documented in government records before Manson ever left prison. It reveals that ordinary biographies contain no immunity. The choir girl, the homecoming princess, the Berkeley librarian. It reveals that the distance between a commune and a killing organization can be crossed in 18 months, one small threshold at a time, without any participant experiencing a single moment that felt like the decision. And it reveals, in the mirror, the case holds up to the culture that consumed it, the most uncomfortable finding of all, that the attention Manson chased from the Terminal Island file to the Diane Sawyer interview was ultimately paid, in full, for 5 decades by all of us. The machine's final component was the audience. Charles Manson killed no one on the nights that made him immortal. That was never the exoneration his defenders wanted it to be. It was, and remains, the entire horror of the case. Everything that happened at Cielo Drive and Waverly Drive was done freely by ordinary young Americans with a man 20 miles away drinking a milkshake. The knife is not the dangerous part. It never was. If this case stayed with you, the archive goes deeper. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case, because the next killer nobody suspected is already living on someone's street, being described by the neighbors as quiet and kind and completely ordinary. They always are.